I'm Daniel Steinberg, and you're listening to The Maggid Method, a new podcast about drushas. Today, we're joined by comedian Eli Lebowicz. Enjoy. You have to establish a connection with the audience at the beginning, and I never, for me personally, I never really got that. I just thought it was just about, you just got to be funny. And, you go to see, for example, Seinfeld, where he takes about 10 minutes in the beginning to work the audience, before he's cute and funny, but the act doesn't start until about 10 minutes in. And I want to hear from you how you learn that lesson and why you think it's so important.
Sure. Yeah, a good portion of my audience, as you know, is Jewish. Most of them are most of the 95% of them are Jewish, and of that 95% are probably Orthodox. So I kind of a little bit know where I'm going to, but with the audience, but I know that I can, like, the importance of relatability. I mean, I think I sell myself a little bit on the fact that I am somebody who knows their experience, who knows their life experience, and can connect that. But I do try to establish that as easily as possible, or I try to establish what kind of material you're going to hear from me early on. I have a joke that I started saying where I say some comedians you've seen at the on the Tonight Show or on Netflix, and me you've seen at the Young Israel of Flatbush, or something like that, where kind of right away that tells you, I don't really go off the vibe of had I like been I didn't really go off the vibe of like does this guy have TV credits? It's more like I think I davened in shul next to this guy. So and adopting is praying. I don't know how much do I have to translate. I don't know, but I very much want to establish, early on that I am speaking your language in the sense that for an Orthodox audience, for example, I'm not purposely like using jargon to pander, but I'm telling you that it's just more natural. Like, this is my background, this is who I am, and this is what I'm telling you right now. These are the kind of jokes that you're going to hear from me in one or two quick jokes. I have a joke about my yarmulke falling in the toilet, which is probably one of my signature bits that I really it tells you a lot about me, and that's really important because an audience and everybody, we like to make these judgments of like, what box do I put this person in, like who are they, and
right. They're trying to figure out exactly, orient themselves around you. Who's this person? Who's in front of me?
Who are you? What do you stand for? What kind of thing? So in at a very quick time, I try to establish that, like, hey, I am somebody who tells self-deprecating jokes, which is big part of my thing. I'm an Orthodox Jew. I'm going to tell jokes that's going to be clean. Those are pretty much in a very, very short amount of time, without even saying it, by telling you these jokes, and this is what I'm opening with. This is a lot of what you're expecting, and you can be like, okay, this, and some of that is also too because I've done shows at synagogues and shuls where they're always nervous about, oh my gosh, is this person going to cross the line? Is this going to be dirty? Is this going to be appropriate? So there is a very important thing, and as from stand up or even giving drushas and speeches, is that you have to kind of get them right away, or if you don't, and I've also, just a quick thing, on your original question, is that if you're doing like a private event, let's say a bar mitzvah, an anniversary party, or whatever, they'll give you personalized material, and you should try to, I think it's usually helpful to try to either mention that up top so that you're kind of establish your credibility, or you're like, hey, I did my research, or like an inside joke type of thing. And that's why, like, a lot of comedians will do the, hey, I went to this diner the other night in this town that they're performing in, to just establish a bond with the audience.
Right. So give me an example of a time when you either forgot to establish the connection, or you tried to establish the connection and it just didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, Well, that's the double-edged sword of this thing is that a lot of the times I perform are either fundraisers or synagogue, events or you know dinners and things like that where it is a little bit built in what that's the expected program and that's what they're expecting to hear. But there are times, listen, I just did performed a Thanksgiving meal pre so I performed for in Toronto on Wednesday night, before Thanksgiving for 500 people. Um, and the next day, I performed for somebody's pre-Thanksgiving meal for 20 people in their living room. And to say that the very different audiences, and I did a lot of the same material, but you it's a bit tricky because you can't just launch into the material. And there are times, yeah, there are definitely times I'm trying to think of, you know, I the challenge I have sometimes is corporate gigs. And I mean, most comedians will tell you corporate gigs are the worst, where you're performing for a holiday party or an office thing, and it's a bunch of people in front of their boss and superiors at work who are just on edge about like, and they say, hey, make jokes about the company. It's like, can you make them? And everyone checks with the boss to see if he's laughing or she's laughing, the same way that people check with the rabbi to see if the rabbi's laughing. So there's this built-in tension, and you're an outsider trying who is inherently an outsider, and you're like, if I go to a synagogue and I can say, hey, I'm Jewish just like the rest of you, and I can find that commonality by nature of the performer and the entertainer element, you're an automatic outsider. I've made the comparison. I say I performed once for a CEO of a company and 10 employees at his house, and I said it's the closest thing to a jester performing before the king. And people
Yeah,
said, like, how was it? Well, I almost got executed. So like it was one of those
right.
situations. It was a really rough thing because that's probably a good example where, it was a night, it was a gig they called me that day of. I didn't even have like time to get like a real shirt, and like it was one of those like, oh gosh, this is probably about
You
six
were summoned to be funny.
someone to be funny. You're more doing comedy at them, and it's just not the right setting. And then you're in the middle of your thing, and then they start going on a whole like mid launch about something else while you're in the middle of talking. Um, and again, kind of like any internet YouTube comment, you remember the negative ones way more than you want to remember the positive ones. I heard a comedian say that it's like Teflon is which ones I forget which one's which. One's Velcro and one's Teflon. Teflon is like the compliments; they're just bouncing off you, and you don't stick with them. But the insults are like Velcro; they like stick to you.
Yeah.
And so the same way,
Mhm.
the bad shows that you remember, the ones that really like, I'm talking about the ones that like really make you reevaluate your life choices, like really do a cheshbon on nefesh, like a really self-evaluation. Like you're like, oh man, am I doing the right thing here?
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll do too many good shows in a row, and you're like, I'm due for a bomb. I'm a bad show right now. So
Right.
yeah, it's you have to tailor it a bit, no matter what you're doing, to do some sort of joke or two or a few about who your audience is, so that they know you're not just and they know you're not just doing like the canned material. I mean, sometimes you can do like, okay, this the same stuff that you've been doing all the time, but you have to at least like establish, you know, some sort of, okay, who are you, and the context of what you're doing in that moment.
Right. Okay. Awesome. Now, so comedians, we rely on relatable experiences. And you once said something really astute to me a couple of years back. You said, John Mulaney, the stand-up comic John Mulaney, is like the Pixar of comedians. And I think what you meant was that everyone of all different ages and genders and backgrounds can enjoy different things about his comedy. Um, so, what advice would you have for a public speaker to identify relatable content to get their audience invested in listening to them talk?
It's ironic, by the way, that John Mulaney probably at this point is not considered the
I
Pixar
know, I
of
know.
which is an
Everybody,
ironic
yeah,
quote. Um,
yeah.
I so this
That's
I'll go
why I
back to the
prefaced
core.
it by saying it was a few years back.
Right. I'll go back to the corporate thing because that's the struggle
Yeah.
I still have is when I'm not doing like I can do great for 90 minutes in front of a synagogue, but sometimes in a corporate gig where it's like a mixed crowd of you know Hasidic Hasidic ultra Orthodox Jews, Hasidic Jews, or people that aren't Jewish that are like like healthcare events and stuff like that. Um, for me, I'm like, okay, well, I can't do my synagogue prayer material. I can't do this insider, stuff like that. All right, let's talk about it. Anyone married, have kids, and then like one person will be married or have kids, and you're like, well, I got nothing for you. Like, that's the thing. So I would say there are things that are you talking about as like a rabbi or just talking about public speaking of trying to connect with your
Public
audience?
speaking, a rabbi and or regular public speaker. Just,
Well,
I
well,
I
I,
think
I
it's
would
kind of universal.
right. I would say try to get in the shoes of who is your audience a little bit more. So, tonight I'm doing a workshop at Yeshiva University, college campus. So I'm not gonna, and I'm not gonna say, hey guys, marriage jokes because there are marriage or kids jokes. It's not gonna work. Maybe do jokes about dating because that's where they're at, or about hey, when I was in college or when I was in YU, this is the stuff that related to me, and usually that works. I mean, I did an alumni show for YU a couple of months ago, and it went really well because I did about 10 minutes up top of jokes about the school and the peripheral, you know, goings on of what happened when I was there, which is a very much of a very, I think, was a smart move because it really, then I can, okay, then you have enough, then you have enough rope if you want to like, all right, let me go into my other stuff that maybe you won't hit. But yeah, you're doing jokes about, about your marriage and your kids. It's not going to work for 21-year olds. It's just not. So, um, find a commonality of something. There's some commonality. Okay, a lot of the Jewish community right now is thinking about Israel. Their heads are what are the war going on in Israel and how that horrible situation. So I think that's something to make a joke about, but that's something to make touch upon the pulse of what the room is thinking. Okay, you're doing a Christmas Eve show, you're doing a thing or a Thanksgiving thing. Okay, this is what's going on. Rabbis, it's like, okay, what's going on? That's why they try to talk at the Parsha. Here's a story we all we just read for 30 minutes. This is a story that we can kind of connect with, or um, something. There's just like a moment, almost like an external mood of the room that you have to be able to like sniff out a little bit and say, hey, is this, and some of that is just talking to people beforehand or getting a vibe. I would also, and when I do comedy, it's like I always want to make sure to get there early so that you can really be there on time. So not to be there on time, so that you can really get a sense of what you're dealing with the crowd.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so you touched upon a bunch of things that I want to get to in a minute, but I wanted to ask you about even when you're entertaining an audience, uh, you still have to manage attention spans because you're the only one talking, and they're laughing. It's a monologue, it's a conversation, but ultimately you're the only one talking. So how do you do that? How do you when it's been a long time, you've been talking for half an hour already. Do you sense audience fatigue? Can you how do you deal with that?
I think it depends on the show is going. Meaning, if you would ask me and say, "Hey, how long can you?" The $1 million question is for a synagogue is, "How long is your show?" And I'm like, "It depends on your event." But if I do like a comedy night at a synagogue, it's usually like about an hour or so. But I'll find very quickly that if the show isn't going well and you're not getting laughs, that hour is suddenly 37 minutes because there is you're a Talmud of Seinfeld, the song and dance and the back and forth of he calls it a conversation, I think, where it's like you
Yeah,
talk, they laugh. You talk, you're playing tennis. You talk, they laugh. You talk, they laugh, and that is really built into the timing of it, the timing of it all and again, if you're having more fun, you can you can play around and like if they're having a good time and you can tell and you can tell very easily, um, then you can hey, I'll throw it. Hey, can we throw out an extra joke here that I would never have tried if it's going badly or not as ideally as you want it, then you're gonna let's make sure we not gonna even go there because I'm not gonna try a new thing that's gonna if everything if my yarmulke in the toilet, which usually is my anchor to bail me out early on to know okay this is going to get a big laugh early on, start there, then go then you can't try out new stuff. But yeah, I think that's comedies are very it's one of the easiest gauges. I mean, I think we talked about this on the when I mentioned on LinkedIn your LinkedIn post where hardest thing about doing Zoom shows was that there was no a lot of I had five people unmuted or six people unmuted, everyone else was muted. So you don't really have a great sense of how it's going. And there's no feedback, there's no response. The only time you get a feedback is that afterwards, if somebody emails you, they were upset. I told my rabbi, he's like, now you know how I feel. So, and that is the fact that you're getting laughs tells you so early on how it's going. And I'm grateful because I have no idea how your Yaakov Shwekis or your other like Jewish entertainers or your singers know if they're enjoying. Everyone kind of just sits there like it's Torah reading, and it'd be like, "You guys having a good time?" People are like, "We never have a good time." Like, it's a very very tough thing to. It's a very tough thing to, because and Jewish audiences also sometimes are not like your biggest laughers. Like I think there's something I don't know if it's a proper etiquette or a like a religious thing sometimes in my experience that there is a like well we have to be serious because like Rosh Hashanah is
Or
right
they're more
behind us.
reserved.
There's a reservations. There's something about you know if you get too like frivolous, there's a thing about that which I'm kind of
Painted
having
makes
that
fancy.
conversation with yeah, but also just like the seriousness of the world and like I think there's two approaches to like how the Jewish experience. Some of it is like yeah we got to make jokes about this because we're terrified, and then there's the no we're terrified so we're terrified, so it's a little bit of a which camp do you fall in, but
Mhm.
the I think too so there is a reservation of like are you guys enjoying this? They're like yeah we are. Like I'll say a joke like sometimes I find like older audiences sometimes in my experience like people in their like 60s and 70s sometimes are not the biggest like laugh out louders. They're smilers and enjoyers that afterwards yeah and you have no idea and you're like if you do a whole crowd and you don't get laughs you're like oh I bombed, this is terrible. But then afterwards, people come up to you and say, like, "Oh, I really enjoyed that." I'm like, "Really?" Because you
Yeah.
weren't laughing. They're like, and they'll be like, "Well, I was thinking it," and you're like, "Oh, well, that doesn't help me."
Yeah.
So there is
So disorienting.
it's sort of disorienting, and it's really hard because if you don't think you're doing well, you're not going to do well. Like
Yeah.
that's the really thing that really messes with you because you can't read their minds, and laughter is the only and laughter's and like yeah, maybe a rabbi can see a nodding and awakeness. You know, those are the your indicators. But for a comedian, if you're not laughing, there's a very clear metric about how this is going, and unless you're really delusional, you can gauge pretty well. Like, and I don't think anyone's going to ever think they did great, and they didn't because
Yeah.
unless they're really delusional. But like, thankfully, it's a pretty easy. This is very easy to tell objectively. Is this going well or not? Which makes it
Right.
very hard when it doesn't go well because like you also know people come up to you afterwards and it's like oh that was great. And when it doesn't go well, people avoid you like the plague. Like oh my gosh, and you're like it feels like I've sometimes said when I've been bombing at shows, I'll say like, do you guys know what a kapara is? This is like an atonement for sins that I've done. Like so yeah, so I think if you're in the middle up there, if you're up there, it's like been 30 minutes, and like you can really tell, are they doing this? But you also like the number one rule, one of the number one rules is if you're set to do this amount of time, you find someone who hired you, who works for the organization or whatever, and gives you a tip off. Or if you're a rabbi giving a speech, you see the clock. You got to know how long you've been up there. So I'll say if I'm doing them an hour, I'll tell somebody, hey, can you let me know it's been 55 minutes or 50 minutes? So I know, hey, like they'll wave a phone and say, okay, fine. That way I'm like, okay, here's where I'm at. All right, here's much time because you lose track of time and the biggest often mistake I will find rabbis do is not connecting with their audience, not knowing their audience. Would be like, all right, so we're gonna have a big share later during the afternoon. So we're gonna do a 20-minute speech now, and you're like, what are you doing to these people? Like, so yeah, I would say connect understanding where your audience is at is really really important, but you can always less is more in certainly in the rabbinic speeches and comedy. If you can, always leave them wanting more.
Right. Um, what would you, I guess, if you have to give a speech and you're not relying on comedy, I mean, you will be funny, but you're not necessarily relying on comedy. What are the measures of success other than people not nodding off?
Hmm. Not fun.
How do you, what kind of calibration are you looking for with the audience?
Um, it's a tough call because I don't really give a lot of speeches that are not comedic.
Yeah,
Um, but I think you kind of note the eye contact and know if it's not Shabbos, is someone or someone on their phone. That's an indicator. Are they looking down? Are they whatever? But um, it's not so easy. I don't think there's an easy way to know because you don't know if you penetrated someone's soul or not, which is, I guess, the entire job of a rabbi in a way, in some ways. So you can't really tell, but you can kind of people. I mean, listen, and anyone who's taken a psychology class, that I hope you have, if or hope if you're becoming a rabbi, you definitely should take a bunch of them or read a book about body language, where you can gauge, I hope, where people are at in their enjoyment. You can tell if someone's enjoying something based on, what they say. I don't know what a percentage is, but a huge percentage of your communication is nonverbal. So there's a lot that, looking at your watch, shuffling in your seat. There is I am paying attention to this. I am not paying attention to this. Watch somebody in it watching a movie. You can tell if they're bored of the movie or they're not.
yeah, yeah. Um, Brevity is really key, meaning trimming down, trimming all the fat away from everything that you have to say. What advice as a comic would you give to a public speaker, even a rabbi, to be able to really trim away all the fat to get to the meat and potatoes of the message?
Well, I would say so. One of the things I've learned is that I'll post on Facebook as a lot of my primary, you know, now it's like Twitter, but Facebook or X, whatever you want to call it. Facebook was a good way for years of me trying out jokes, and that was where it was. And you can there's no limit there, or really, there's no limit. So often, if I'll bring a Facebook joke to Twitter, where Twitter's, I don't know, the 240 characters, I think is the current limit, that'll really get you to the point, that'll get you almost to the point of like, oh, this could be cut. There's a lot of fat here that's unnecessary. So that's something to think about is like, try it out as a tweet and, almost like, even if you're just putting it in a template and see how that goes, that'll kind of really tell you where you're ranting, you're rambling, and I'm not the best at this at all. My 6-year-old, I'm sure, will tell you that I just talk a lot. Uh, but you, yeah, I think that's the thing is is think of it like a paper almost, where it's like, okay, what's the point and where are you being extra? Where are you being, do you really need that third that third story at the end, or that third connection? I there's a rabbi I remember that the way he speaks, his cadence, the way he speaks, it sounds like every sentence could be the end of the speech. And I say it's a little bit like when you're watching playoff hockey. When you're watching hockey in the playoffs in overtime, it's like very, very like high energy, and there's like any goal could be it. So any like fast break, any shot on goal is like and like like, oh, it goes wide. Like that is how I felt listening to this rabbi speak, where it was like he went down, he went up, and then he went down, and like anything could have been. And everybody, we should have peace for the Jewish people, and good job. It could have been the end of every sentence he said, or just by his nature of his speaking. um so I don't think you want that. You want to also give indicators of where you're at in your delivery. um and I think, yeah, I think, like you said, we said less is more. Brevity is important. I think a really important point, this is just not related to your question exactly, is, and I find this with my comedy as well, is don't assume everybody knows. There's nothing more condescending than a rabbi saying everybody knows there's a famous medrash, there's a famous story, everybody knows, and you're sitting there. If you're one of the people who doesn't know, well, now you feel bad about yourself for no reason. And I know you mean it and it's an innocuous comment. I don't think they mean it that way, but I have a bit about the sota, which is like a very like esoteric, thing in the Torah about, a woman who's accused of adultery and whatever. have a whole joke about it, but I a clip that I posted, I realized I said you may remember sota, and I shouldn't have said remember. I said for those of you that don't know, because I should one of the challenges I find for my comedy is I need to educate more if I'm going to do a very Jewish inside baseball
Esoteric.
topic. Yeah, if I'm doing a very esoteric topic, I need to educate more and pretend they don't know. And worst case scenario, if people already know it, they're not going to be like, "Oh, we already know this." Like, because you're talking about how well do they necessarily know every aspect of the Torah, or don't assume your experience is necessarily universal about a lot of the things, because you, as a rabbi, okay, you've learned a lot more than people. There's there's a rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Menachem Leibtag, who gives great shiurim and great less classes about Tanakh and the Bible, the Old Testament. And but he has, I noticed that he has this thing, because he's so smart and he's so well versed. He has this habit of, I noticed when he says, he would say, how it's, you remember, you remember Zachariah Paragimel, and everyone's like, there's a Zachariah now, like, like, you know, I think he means it kind of jokingly, because he's like saying tongue in cheek, like he's like, yeah, I do this for a living and I know this, inside and out.
Yeah.
And a lot of people haven't even cracked open, a Bible in a while, or if ever. So I think he means a little tongue in cheek, but I just always find it funny that he's just like, you'll say like the most esoteric or random parts of the Bible that like people don't really pick up or know. And I'll just be like, you remember, you remember does it sound familiar? And like, everyone's like,
Right.
no.
I don't know if you've ever seen this clip, but and it was so eye-opening to me. It's Jerry Seinfeld talking to the late Gary Shandling, and he talks about how Gary had this technique in his act where he had an arc to his act, and it gave the audience a frame of reference as to where he was and where he was going and where they had just been. So, for example, let's say he was talking about growing up and then dating and then marriage and then child rearing. So it gave a kind of a thread that people could follow so that they understood where he was going. And I'm wondering, do you do that? Do you try to give people a frame of reference as to where they are in the act so that um, because you're releasing information to them in a linear fashion. They have no idea. They can't scroll. They can't fast forward. They have no idea where you are until you release the next bit, and the next bit, and the next bit. So, do you find that that gives some type of frame of reference for the audience to anchor them to where you are, so that they can kind of understand where this is going? That's
Um,
yeah,
no, it's definitely an interesting thing, and I'm realizing that it's like that's why when you read the Da Vinci Code or any of those Dan Brown books, you're like, oh my God, it's only a two page chapter. This is great because you could like really stop anytime. And so I wish I had that more in my act. I really do, and it's something I really got to work on. It's almost like looking at a chess. It's like playing chess, where you can look at other people's acts and like see, oh, this is where they could have gone. Like Nate Bargatze had a recent special about like, and he had a joke about like his house being backwards or something like that, and he ended something about like being locked out, and I was like, oh my God, how did he not like dovetail this together? It would have been perfect. And I noticed that as myself. But I just watched, as you, I think you know that and we've spoken about this, how Mike Birbiglia is like a huge influence of mine. How
yeah,
he is a great storyteller and comedian, and I just really like rewatched. I went to his show live, but I watched on Netflix his new one called Old Man in the Pool. And I don't think this one dovetails. This one kind of like tracks as much as he does, but his other ones, like called Thank God for Jokes or the new one and things like that, they really, My Girlfriend's Boyfriend and stuff like that. He has a lot of specials, and they kind of do that where starts with a story. I'm telling you a huge story here, and then he kind of intersperses, goes back in time, and he comes back, and he or reorients you and says, "So I'm in Sleepwalk with Me." He has all these things where he says, "I'm going to start a story here, and I will side note. Here's a joke. Here's a whole joke chunk that I thought of on this topic. Now back to the story. No, no, no. Now back to the story." And I think somebody who I think does it very well. I just listened to I went to a share live with Rabbi David Bashevkin, who really he's also a big comedy fan, so I think he really understands also the linear, need for sure. Where he will say, "We have," another but can you hear me?
your video froze for a second there. It's
Oh, okay, just
still
making
on
sure.
the front.
So he will say like he had this whole thing about how in the parsha he just gave a share about he does like parsha and he kind of ties it into like Jewish history a little bit. So he was saying like, oh, how like we talked about how Lavan and Yaakov's father-in-law, Jacob's father-in-law Lavan, how he like runs away from him, and then we mentioned it in the Pesach Seder, and then he like goes on a digression, or not like a purposeful digression, where he says, let's establish this, this, and this, how this has anything to do with it, and then back to the original question. And like it definitely helps. It definitely helps you, and it's something I wish I could kind of implement in terms of, because some of my stuff is like a little disjointed, and I do love the Seinfeldian, and I mean Seinfeld the show in that regard, to be able to really dovetail everything back together so it's like fitting like a piece. Also, because there is nothing better that an audience loves more than crowd work, which is like on the spot, hey, oh, I thought this is a shared experience just for us right now. But it's called a callback, where you drop something earlier and then you later, say, say something. I mean, if I can put that in, but like, because you basically later make a reference to that joke earlier, and
Mhm.
everyone it's
Yeah.
still appreciated because it's just like, oh, you actually know what you're doing here, like you're actually planning this, because there's nothing worse. I think Tina Fey said this in Bossy Pants, a book. I remember she compared it to like a pilot, that you're a pilot, and if if they feel worried for you, they're going to be worried. So you have
Yeah.
to exude the confidence that you know what you're doing. Again, even if you're straight out of rabbinical school, and you're like, "Hi, I'm going to give a drasha on this." Forgive my Simpsons teenager voice, but it's big influence of mine. So, but if they're nervous for you, you got to exude the confidence a little bit and say, act like you've been there before, even if you haven't. That's a really tough thing.
Yeah.
You got to act like you've been there
Yeah.
before because if they're feeling nervous, I'm like, is this guy okay? Then they're gonna think that, and then they're gonna think, okay, I don't know if I can laugh. So to be able to have a clear path of where you're at it would certainly be helpful, especially again. So it's like because if you started with a question, you're gonna you hopefully should get back to that. There's nothing a little bit more frustrating than when my wife and I are watching a movie and she'll ask me a question and be like, why did they do that? Who is that? And I said, if it's a good movie, they'll probably tell us. You know, I know as much as you, and like, but if you start with a question, odds are you're going to answer the question. Or if you started with a random, Holocaust story, you're going to hopefully tie it in, or you should, or else
Yeah.
what was it, red herring? Is that, or you're giving a random piece of information anecdotally for no reason. So try to have try to have like less disjointed points. And I would also try to, I've told comedians this where I said, there's so much about you that we could extrapolate that you should dive into more. And for myself too, but where like find a theme, you can find a theme. That way, it's like you need like almost like it's not a title, but find a theme of what and your theme isn't just you. And I'm still trying to figure that out for myself, but find a theme of your jokes almost so that you can will help with segues, so you're not just like randomly like, all right, so let's talk about the weather, rather than, okay, for me, I try to go from, okay, I'm a comedian, I'm a very Jewish comedian. I talk about Judaism, then I talk about Israel, and then I talk about flying sometimes, and I talk about having a baby or being married. And sometimes it doesn't all connect super well, and you don't need that, but there are ways to really mesh it together.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Um, I find that it helps me remember what I want to say when I have an intuitive arc because there's let's say it's a chronological order that you follow or whatever order whatever sequence makes sense, but it helps you. There's like categories of jokes, and they all fit subcategories underneath, and then you move to the next category, next category. So I find that it gives the audience a frame of reference, and it also helps me remember where I am.
I have no idea how you're like your Mitch Hedbergs or your Dimitri Martins or your Stephen Wrights or your one-liner
Yeah,
comedians,
Henny
your Anthony
Youngman's, Don
Jeselnik's, your
Rickles.
one-liner comedians. I have no idea how they remember where they're at, or you know, how they remember anything, because I think it's like lugging where it's like you can remember like 5 to 7 or 5 to 9 different like ideas at a time or something. And if you treat them as disjointed one sentence jokes, that's a lot more to remember.
Like 500 of them, you know.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So talk to me about storytelling because comedians are storytellers. And what do you have a certain uh, approach to storytelling in terms of the point of view, the perspective that you do voices? How do you approach storytelling?
It's something I
How
really
much
want.
detail do you put in?
Right. It's something that for myself, it's something I've always wanted to get into. I mean, I took a storytelling class with this guy, Jeff Zimmerman, who's a comedian, who he had a great story on the Moth, which is like a storytelling thing. I just listened to Alex Edelman, who is who had a really successful Broadway show, who talks about growing up Orthodox as an Orthodox Jew. He has a great story on NPR about how his family celebrated Christmas one year because his mom had like a coworker who like was alone, and they figured it was a bigger mitzvah to celebrate Christmas than and we had to do this kindness for this woman than to whatever. But he has a great story where it's like I'm like, this is amazing. This is like an art of being able to just like weave it in and whatever. I think with stories, it's really, really important. And you, as I'm saying, you from your Mike Birbiglias, your Gary Gulmans, your Alex Edelman, these guys who are really, really great at it, to be able to give context, give enough background information, but you cannot go too long without a joke. In a stand-up way, you can't go without too long without a joke. And I'm not, and that could be every 10 seconds. It really depends. But the longer story you tell, the bigger the payoff has to be. Because it's an investment. They are invested in your story. And if this story is 6 minutes, better be great, better be worth it. So the same thing of, why are you telling me this story? Is this relevant? I mean, you got to, if you're going to include details, and it's important to include necessary details. This is where trimming the fat is important. Necessary but not extraneous details. I'll say that my wife and I have very different ways of telling a story, and I don't know if this is just women in general, but at least this is my wife, that like it's just there is a rhythm that you need to like pick up on, that like it's like, all right, well, we went to the thing, and like I didn't know what I was going to get, if I was going to get a salad and I was going to get a sandwich, and I went with the sandwich, and it was I was hungry at the time, and you're losing it, you're losing people, and in terms of the way you're telling a story, because the bandwidth is only so much, and you got to keep them engaged every step of the way, or else they're going to fall by the wayside. So yeah, include, and from a comedy standpoint, you got to include the specifics. Almost the specifics is better, but I mean, like, in the sense that like you like cut to the what is important here. I think Alex and Mike were going to talk about different like jokes they had to cut from their shows, because it messed with the overall arc of what I'm trying to tell here. And that's like almost like an hour long story, in a sense. So I mean, Alex's show, Just for Us or something, was about going to a neo-Nazi rally as a Jew, almost like undercover, but like whatever. That's like the pretense of the show. So like I think these one man shows, and these are definitely things to watch for anybody trying to learn how to craft it's an hour long drasha. It's pretty incredible. So I think it's really, really crucial to give the important details. And yes, if you can act out and do different voices, as I went to the doctor, and instead of saying the doctor said, he says, make it more, if the Torah would just said, God said to Adam, and then again, then he said, Adam responded this, it makes it much more interesting to read.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so different perspective, different points of views, really, really helpful. Different characters, if possible, different things to kind of color the story, or else, there are very few movies. I would say 12 Angry Men is a good example of a story that takes place in one room and doesn't have a lot of, but there's still 12 different characters at least. So if that story, that movie is interesting, is a great movie, because it's 12 characters who have very different motivations and different things, but overall the arching story is, here's what we're here for.
Yeah. I think of two specific routines where they're maybe 10, 12 minutes. They're stories, and they're like mini movies. I'll give you an example. One of them I'm thinking of is Eddie Murphy's routine with the barbecue as a kid when he goes to his parents' barbecue. I don't know if you remember that
I don't know it.
with his Aunt Bunny.
I don't know it.
Yeah. Okay. It's what I
This
mean.
is this is our this is our age this
12
is our
minutes
age
long. I
gap.
clocked it, and there's so many characters in that movie. The other one is the John Mulaney one where he talks about stranger danger. That one where
Oh
remember
yeah,
that one?
Bittenbinder.
Yeah. So that one also is long. I mean, there's the teachers that usher the kid into the assembly room. There's the sergeant, the police sergeant. There's and there's so many characters in that, and it goes in so many different directions. And it's one guy telling a story for like 12 minutes, and I mean, it's a movie. So those are I'm always fascinated by
Also,
those. But
that's the Gary Goldman's state abbreviation one too.
yeah,
Gary Goldman's been
yeah.
about how they came the documentary about coming up with the state abbreviations. I would also say is a very good quote unquote story in a way.
Mhm. Yeah. You remind me of the just to digress for a second, this Billy Crystal routine where his daughter says, "You mean Paul McCartney was in another band before Wings?" you know. Uh, yeah, I mean, before there was Chris Rock, there was Eddie Murphy, and there was all these guys. But
There's a couple of people that
anyways,
there's a couple of people in my age that I missed the timing just of when I was born, where Eddie Murphy
yeah,
as a stand-up comedian instead of the Doctor Dolittle guy, or Steve
yeah,
Martin. I mean, that was also before a lot of people's times, but like Steve Martin, everyone's like, "Oh, he was hilarious," and I'm just like, it doesn't
yeah,
resonate with me the same way. I can't
right,
think of him that way.
right, right. Okay, so just a couple of quick questions. I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I want to hit you with a bunch of questions in terms
Sure,
of
whatever.
scripted versus spontaneous, rehearsed. How rehearsed are you? How well do you stick to the verbiage of the joke? How do you how do you maintain spontaneity when you're saying the same thing over and over and over?
That's a good question. The spontaneity. I mean, you pretty much have your things down to a science almost of what's worked and what's worked in the past. It's a science experiment of hey, this has worked for a bunch of times. Odds are this should work again, hopefully. Um, but yeah, there is a way to make sure that you're kind of delivering it. I mean, I'll change the order of the way I say things, like when I'll go to it, when I'll not. I
Sorry to
think
bore you.
what? No, I'm sorry. I have children. Um, uh, Having children means never being able to finish a conversation with an adult, uh, or a story. I mean, I think Louis C.K. If I can mention him anymore, he it's one of those. It's one of those you had a Yamashimo for anyone who's been canceled or like semi Yamashimo. I don't know. But I'm just kidding. But he, because he said something about like he would take to challenge himself, he would put his opening joke at the end or his closer at the beginning or something like that. Every
Yeah,
time to make his act stronger. So I change the order sometimes of what I do. I don't really have a I have a I think jokes related to each other, but I'm kind of just I have my chunks and I'm like, all right, this seems like this is something I can do. And I always like if I can find a natural way to go into it. Spontaneity, I'm not the greatest at crowd work. I really need to be better at it, but sometimes crowd work messes you up because you're like, oh, I was finding this. What was I thinking about? And like going back to where was I is very challenging because you have to kind of keep this narrative almost in your head or this where were you in the pacing of things. But I think there's a way to make sure that like you rehearse or you I do it enough, thank God, at this point where I can tell it where it's like it's fresh, but that's also why you want to write new jokes too and write new drushes because if you can do an entire hour that you've done before, but if you have 3 new minutes that you're like want to see how it goes, like that helps. That helps a lot. Um, and rehearsing, like I said, it's performing enough. Any comedian will tell you, like I think Seinfeld would say, like, I want to go to these seminars and just say, what's the key to success or key to being funny? He says, I just
Just
want to tell
work.
hopeless sentences, do the work,
Yeah,
perform, write, and
it's the best school.
yeah, that's pretty much it for
Yeah. What about stage fright? Talk to me about
that.
that.
It's natural to have some. It's natural to have some always, but again, like an experiment where you're like, I've done this enough times where it's done well that, and enough. I have enough of a sample size at this point where it's like, hey, I'm again, unless you're really diluted, I'm good at this. I can do this well enough. Done enough shows, and it's a lot. It's a lot. It's something that goes away. It goes away, not fully necessarily, but like you say, like, okay, I've done this before, and like practicing anything, the more you do it, the more you get out there. But also, like, it's like early on, I remember people would be like, "Oh, how do you like? Why do you do comedy? What if it doesn't go well? Like, aren't you nervous? Like, what does it go? It doesn't go well." And I'm like, you know what? It's a little bit of like, what's the worst that can happen attitude, which is a really healthy thing to feel because what's the worst that could happen? Worst that could happen in a thing in a 5 minute set is okay, and especially in a lineup with other comedians. Okay, it doesn't go well. These people didn't enjoy me. It's gonna ruin my night. I'll feel bad, but like practically, I have enough wins that like okay, it balances out. Early on, so it's like you're giving a drush and it doesn't what is the drush not going well? You lose the things the mechanics you can kind of work on. If you stutter, you can work on it. If you your projection, those are things you can work on. And like the good thing about being a rabbi or being a drush giving a drush is I don't think anyone's going to tell you that was horrible unless you like said something like off the beaten path or got way too political than you should have or stuff like that. I mean, you are dealing with Jews, so you're going to get opinions, but the what's the worst that could happen is a big thing. And from a stage fright standpoint, like if you can get over the hurdle of like speaking in front of others, which takes time, um, but you know what? I think that's probably why have bar and bat mitzvahs. People are reading from the Torah to give you early on at 12 and 13. You're like, all right, I'm going to read a text I don't know and in another language. And again, like a bar mitzvah kid, I would tell them like they're here for you, and they may not even be paying attention fully, but like you practice this for a reason.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to ask you about, in terms of like, what advice do you have for a public speaker who wants to inject humor or edginess into their talks while still staying within the bounds of professionalism and appropriateness? How do you find that line? You as a comedian are
Um,
hyper attuned to it, but and sometimes you cross it and you have to scale back. But how someone who's a speaker, a rabbi using humor, how do you make sure that's what kind of guardrails can you give them so
I
that
think
you can
joking
use
about
it,
state. I think
wield
you
it,
could joke.
wield it,
Sorry, keep going.
wield it responsibly?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, listen, when it comes to edginess, also as a rabbi, your curve of humor is going to be way higher and better than a comedian. So if you are a rabbi, and this is great for you, Daniel, because you're a rabbi and a comedian. So you automatically get but as a rabbi, as a comedian, the expectation to be funny is way higher. As a rabbi, if you're remotely funny, you are hilarious. So
Right,
the
right.
levels of what you can, and then go with safe topics. You go with safe topics like, Jews Jews eating, in-laws, marriage a little bit, people being on their phones, people falling asleep doing their thing, self-deprecating is
Punching
okay
down.
enough. Punching to yourself, punching punching up, I think is a
Sorry.
thing. But
Right.
like, don't get political. You're gonna be that's too divisive. Don't get, but like, there are things that they're just topics that are just like fair game. I said a joke the other night. I said about El Al, which is like the main airline to go to Israel, and they've been doing amazing things since this war started. That they've been taking God knows how many bags to Israel for supplies to send to the war effort and to people that are the victims. And it's I said something. I said I made a joke about El Al. I was in a whole routine about El Al, and I said, guys, I know El Al's been doing amazing work, but if we can't make jokes about El Al, the terrorists win, you know. And I would think like El Al making jokes about El Al, about airlines and about Jewish airlines is like it's a pretty safe topic, you know. So when it comes to definitely insert things. I mean, Dev Bashevkin, like I mentioned the other day, I mentioned his share from from the other day was great because there's a lot of like different like perfectly timed jokes where he talks about how staying at your father-in-law's, like who hasn't wanted to leave in the middle of the night, type of thing, like stuff like that where it's a safe thing, you're gonna whatever, that's a good way of keeping your audience engaged. I mean, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, would start with a joke almost always. I think, if I recall, I mean, if it was about anti-Semitism, but still, he would break the ice, with a joke, get you. All right, I'm paying attention now, type of thing. And it's definitely a useful tool. But I think you don't have to go super edgy. I think go for you don't have to what a Laffy Taffy joke is, and you don't have to do that. But find a comedian and be like, hey, can you help me insert a joke here? I mean, I try to write a joke about the Parsha all the time, or at least something relevant um, that will resonate. And I think that it's definitely certainly appreciated by
Right.
people.
Okay. Last question I want to ask you is you, as a comedian and as a storyteller, you know how to engage audiences really, really well. And the problem is that I find that when you, I don't know if you have an opportunity to speak much or educate much, but what happens is that it's almost becomes like clickbait, where you start off with, you grab their attention with a story, with something really engaging or dramatic or shocking or funny or whatever it is. And then, okay, everybody laughs and everybody loved it. And now, okay, now we're going to, now to the boring stuff. And then they just tune out because there's no consistency between the story or the joke or what you're about to say. And so you start to train people that they perk up for the funny parts or the interesting parts or the dramatic parts, and then they tune out as soon as you start to inject any substance into it. So my question is what advice would you have in order to maintain that attention all the way through, where you have to grab their attention at the beginning to get them to listen to you, but you don't want to train them to only like a dog and pony where you're
Right.
just jumping through hoops and tricks in order to keep their attention. You're there to impart some type of substance.
Well, I think also as a comedian, if I ever want to to an important Jewish message or a Torah message, I actually have an advantage. The same way that I guess it makes up for the rabbis having the humor advantage. I have the Jewish moral advantage and the
Lessons
rebuke
expected of
advantage.
you.
I can give you a lesson, and it'll be received much more highly from a congregant because I'm doing it in a subversive, funny way, making a point. I'm making a point about the stupidity of superficial dating, and stuff like that, and rather than you being on a soapbox type of thing. So, but I would say the same technique that we said about the storytelling is that just because you're inserting jokes every so often not to keep them on their toes, you're just trying to you're making it interesting. You're making it engaging. I mean, I'm saying again, I'll use the David Bashevkin example because the other day he was he was talking about like how he's saying there was he certain yeshivas said as he was on the bus to the rally to DC, he got an email. He saw an email or a WhatsApp group. It was said like, oh, certain yeshiva was like, oh, we can't, we're not supporting this rally. People shouldn't go to the rally. And he's like, all right, so I told them to turn the bus around. Like which is a funny thing, like right there. That's just like a short thing that happened, and it's just like that's just part of being able to engage and say you read over your routine and say where is this lagging, where is this boring, where is this, and whether or not, and that doesn't, and it's not just necessarily humor, but like, watch a Michael Biglia a show, and there are points you raise where it gets serious. It's really serious and quiet, and it's okay to bask in that silence and whatever. It doesn't have to be funny the whole time, but it has to be interesting. And humor isn't, it's not just humor. Humor is there because you're just like, okay, I want to laugh, and that's the way to engage. That's our particular way of doing it. But a humor, you can have a really poignant moment where you talk about an inspiring story. They found a quote. They found, I saw that they see it in one of the Gaza, one of the rubble. They found like a mezuzah, with on it, whatever, something like that. You just like find something to get a connection. It's the same thing that we were talking about the whole time. Is like establish these moments of connection of like, okay, and it's not easy because you want to, and some parshiot are easier than others. I mean, Bereshit. I think the reason the Torah starts with Bereshit because God wanted to start off everybody on the right foot. If he started with carbonot and animal sacrifices, he would have lost everyone in the beginning. So, start with stories about these are human characters and sibling rivalry. Like, take it from God, who literally like catered the Torah to be the first 15 or 15 to 17 parshiot or sections of the Torah, four portions of the Torah are super interesting with stuff going on, a lot of stuff going on in each one that you can really take apart lessons. And then once you're in there, okay, here's the whole lessons about, and I'm not, I don't want to like, I was gonna say that's a little condescending to say, but I mean that in the sense that I think there is a lot element of of human connection. We gravitate to the stories of Genesis and Bereshit because of there's such a human element in there. There's sibling rivalry. There's marital strife. There's going against adversity. There's it's whatever Joseph
Yeah.
Campbell. Any like the human
Right.
condition. These stories,
Right.
they're literally
The
just
reason that
yeah.
yeah the reason the honeymooners are still funny today, 75 years later. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah,
What's the
the show Seinfeld, even if cell phones could solve half the issues, is relatable because this is how people kind of act. It's a lot more realistic. Your Curb Your Enthusiasms are interesting because Larry David may not be the likable character inherently, but he's almost everyone's like id of he's literally like there's a lot of times you're like, no, he's right. You can't say that, but he's right. And that's interesting. Steve Carell on The Office, Michael Scott is saying, "Oh my God, I had a boss like that. That was so tactless. I had a boss like that just said what he was thinking without, and like I have to sit through all these boring meetings without somebody, talk. Don't be like Michael Scott on your if you're giving a drasha, but like in the sense, but there are the same way that I would say the Hasidic element is like everybody's got like a spark in them of like there's like a Jewish spark that wants to ignite. There's also a human spark, and there's a reason every movie or TV show throughout time is about the same topics, about love, about happiness, about finding yourself, about struggle, about things that are just if I literally have a joke on my business cards. It says some were popular in high school, others became comedians, and the reason I have that, part of the reason is because you need a joke that's on your business cards, or else it's like, all right, here you go. But also because I think like there's a little level of like if you haven't gone through a hard life at all, which some people have not gone through that hard of a life. Everyone's got their things, but like you going through the tough, going through the challenge makes it, I won't say makes it interesting, but makes you have substance to your life. There's a reason
Yeah.
so many comedians are black and Jewish,
Yeah. And
because
from
when
New
you've
York.
gone what
And from New York,
from
where
when you've gone
yeah.
through real struggle and real hardship, you come out on the other side with an ability to really connect and have substance to your life. So to be able to, I mean, you know, I think there's a reason, the same reason why, like to pray, to be the davening for the Amud to lead the services. I think on the high holidays, you're supposed to be, I think, like 40 or married and stuff like that. I think part of
Yeah.
that is because you need to be a person in the world who's like had some stuff. You've you've had arguments on Friday afternoon with your spouse. You've dated and it hasn't gone well before. You've gone through situations the same way. I would say, it's very interesting as probably a rabbi, a young rabbi probably has a big challenge of if of not dealing, like, if, like, let's say, dealing with death or loss, where, you know how do you deal with that when, if you haven't gone through it? And, like, I went through loss early in my life, and when I was a teenager, my mother passed away, and, like, it's one of those things where I think I was able to be there now. Unfortunately, where a lot of, I think I wouldn't when I think your father passed away. Um, I was able to, like, kind of go and make a shiva call, and kind of call my friends, who understanding that this is the maybe what they're feeling, or being able to be there for them at this time. So it was a very long answer and ranting, which a rabbi shouldn't do, but to be able to really, there's so many points of connectivity that you can do that are just human elements that are shared experiences.
Got it. One last thing came to mind, and just a super quick answer will suffice, and that is, how much of yourself do you share in your act? And I'll give a little
Mm,
background to the question. I think I posted about this a while back. I was listening to an episode of WTF where Mark Maron interviewed Billy Crystal, and he said that Jack Rollins challenged Billy Crystal when he was at kind of beginning of his career. He said, "You're not being risky enough. You're not showing who you are to the audience. You're doing these impressions of Muhammad Ali. You're doing funny stuff, but the audience has no idea who you are as the person. You're not saying, I think this, I feel this, this is my attitude, this is my opinion." And he said, you're not taking enough risks. You're not being honest enough with the audience. How much of that do you do as a comedian, and how much as a speaker do you like to see in a speaker?
I think definitely, the speaker, you need it. I think when people talk about their origin stories or their backgrounds, I think it's very interesting, and I think it helps, as a connect, like we were saying early on, like, the I tell these jokes, this kind of almost, not because I think they're funny and good openers, but also to, like, kind of establish, okay, here's where I'm at. I don't do it enough about really the deep nitty gritty of my life. Some of that is also because of, like, family stuff that I don't want to, I'll tell jokes about my wife, but, like, they're not like, they're not, like, first I run all my jokes by my wife and my mother-in-law, but they're not as, I don't think
They're not
they're
specific.
necessarily they're not they are in a way, but they're not exactly about my wife, in the sense that I think they're about marriage. So, like, I think that but there are kernels of my life that I don't really share. You listen, I mentioned just now, like, my mother passing away when I was 17. Like, I don't talk about that on stage, partially because I haven't found a way to make that funny, or, like, um yeah, or is that something to include. But I think, yeah, being able to share a bunch of yourself will just certainly establish where you're at, where you just, like, there's something about, like, George Clooney in the movie Up in the Air, where he just, like, gives this whole talk about what's in your bag. And you don't realize that he's, like, this guy who, like, never wanted to, like, commit to a relationship and get married and stuff like that. But, like, he just exudes this, like, confidence and being able to like delve into the heart of what he's about in a very condensed way. So you can kind of get to that in the cliff notes of yourself, but you don't, and without, if you don't want to share too much, especially from the pulpit where your whole life is kind of could be on display. And, I don't know if your family signed up for it. It's a tough thing, but yeah, definitely it's worth giving your background of who you are, to add to the credibility too.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right, I think that about covers it. That was awesome. I know we could talk the whole day, and it's a lot of fun. We'll have to send each other some follow-up show notes, different clips and stuff. But that's awesome.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And what I'll do is,
yeah. I was going to give a plugs for myself or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Plug away.
Well, I'm doing a bunch of shows all around the United States in the next month or so. And I'll be at December 25th. I'm doing a show at City Winery opening for Joel Chasnoff, who you mentioned. This week, which it might be before that, the week of November 27th, I'm doing shows in New York opening for Ami Kozak. But you can find my stuff at Eli Lebowicz on Twitter, ELILEBOWICZ on Twitter, and Eli Comedyogram on Instagram. Also, I've been doing some sketches with Ami Kozak and Mikey Greenbuck called J Sketch that people seem to be enjoying. Yeah, thank you.
Those. Yeah, those are so much fun.
Thanks.
Okay, so people check out the website. People check out your Twitter, and where all fine comedians are found.
Thanks. Awesome. Yeah, my website is elicomedy.com because Lebowitz is impossible to spell, so elicomedy.com.
I'm Daniel Steinberg, and you've been listening to The Maggid Method. And to download your free copy of The Maggid Method of Public Speaking, the definitive playbook for crafting life-changing presentations for 21st century attention spans, visit maggidmethod.com. MAGG